Hi everybody, it's Lavender Town, and I hope that you're somewhere cozy and safe, because I'm going to be reading a creepypasta to you. I know I've been saying I'm going to do this video for a while, and now it's finally happening, so without further ado, this is my reading and illustration of Turn It Off by Daniel Dubois. I rested my arms behind my head, skim reading the credits of a movie I'd just watched. After seeing them through about halfway, I lifted myself from the sofa and walked to the kitchen, stretching my arms out above me. I opened the fridge door and found a full carton of juice, so I sat down on the kitchen counter by the window, cracked open the lid, and took several long gulps. When I couldn't drink any more, I wiped my mouth on the back of my hand. My evenings were uneventful around this time in summer. It was 9:15 p.m. on Saturday in July. School was out for the holidays, and my parents had gone to visit my aunt and uncle, who lived by the coast. They would be gone for 2 more weeks. I declined the invitation to join them. I didn't dislike the place or my relatives, but we usually stayed there so long that I'd miss most of my summer break, and I'd truthfully rather spend it with my friends in town. I was a good kid who knew how to wash clothes and use an oven, and generally not an idiot, so they let me stay at the house so long as I kept it clean. As I sat, I looked out into the garden to check for anything scary in the dark. It was empty and black. I kind of wish we had a pet. A cat or dog would be nice about now, but their hair always made me sneeze and my eyes go red and itchy. With that in mind, my dad said no, even though I wouldn't mind it. 9:22 p.m. I put the rest of the juice carton back into the fridge door and went back over by the window. Hoisting myself up onto the counter again, I glanced out to the garden and identified the shadows one by one to make sure everything was in its place. The bushes were in their usual shape. 2 small trees stood together by the back fence, and a metal table with 4 chairs sat casually on the patio. I like to check these things, which is largely why I wasn't scared of the dark. I would always get up to investigate small noises in the night, and I hated sleeping with my face to the wall. If someone was in my room at night, I'd rather know about it, so at least there was the faintest chance of getting away somehow. This meant that my worries were quickly put to rest, as I either found nothing downstairs, but the radiator popping with the heat, or opened my eyes to see an empty bedroom. Not knowing what could be making odd noises from the kitchen, or on the stairs, or in my room is what makes my skin creep. 9:30 p.m. I got down from the counter and wandered back into the living room to turn off the TV, and decided to take the rest of the juice upstairs. I went back into the kitchen, opened the fridge door, and stopped. Turning my head to focus outside, I could see someone was standing in the garden. I shut the fridge door and turned off the light so they couldn't see me so easily, and moved slowly to lean on the kitchen counter to get a better look. All the doors were locked and all my neighbors were home. I took a moment to remind myself this. Still, my heart quickened a bit as I stood there, straining to see his or her shape in the darkness at the end of the garden. I had to keep glancing away to keep their fuzzy outline clear in my vision. They were standing very still and a little thin, but that's all I could see. I couldn't tell anything else. "Oh," I said aloud. It was the garden umbrella leaning against the back fence. I forgot we used it for barbecues. I smiled at myself, pleased I didn't get too worked up, and went upstairs to my bedroom. I laid on the bed and propped my head up on a pillow, opening my laptop on my stomach to see if anybody was online. Apparently someone else was bored and saw my name pop up. It was my buddy Chris. We chatted for a little bit, and he suggested that we do an old-fashioned campout in my backyard with a tent I knew my parents had. I agreed to get up from my laptop and check it, then return to the chat. So I got up from my bed and headed to check the cupboard under the stairs. I didn't know where the tent was, but it seemed like a good place to start. I opened the cupboard door and started shifting coats aside. Some cardboard boxes were stacked up at the back and might be hiding it, so I started unstacking them. I took out a couple of the easy-to-reach ones and had a stroke of good luck as the tent bags came into view. I leaned over the other boxes and picked up the bag, and took the big garden umbrella that sat beside it too, just in case it rained tomorrow. I paused. I put the tent down. It took me a couple of seconds to get back to the kitchen window and focus on the darkness outside. My eyes weren't adjusted yet to the dark, so I couldn't see all the way to the back fence. Turning off the kitchen light, I leaned on the counter and continued staring at the same point. The other garden features began to fade into view one by one, fitting my previous mental image. I wasn't sure what I wanted to see. The darkness gave way to the familiar forms I knew, but after a while I was certain there still stood a figure against the back garden fence. It can't have been the umbrella. I had just seen it. It hadn't moved. I stood there for 15 minutes looking at it. I couldn't tell its shape properly, but it did look like someone standing there. I decided it wasn't a threat. I thought if I was in any real danger, I would have been a lot more worried by now, and that thought kept me calm. But I also wanted to find out what it was. I couldn't stand there forever. I jogged upstairs, picked up my laptop, and brought it down with me to the counter. I asked Chris if he could come as fast as he could, because I was getting spooked, and I thought I could see something in the back. He agreed. I sat there watching the black shape lean against the fence for another 10 minutes. Eventually, the doorbell rang. I opened it and Chris ran in. "I'm over here," I said, walking to the kitchen. I switched off the light and pointed in the figure's direction. "Look." "Give me a sec," said Chris. "I can't see properly." A minute later, he noticed. "The black thing?" "Yeah." We both stood there looking at it for a while. I half expected it to be gone when he looked. He leaned over the counter. "It's just a big plant or plank of wood or something. Let's go watch TV." "Will you check with me just to make sure?" I asked. "Do you have a torch?" he returned. "No," I admitted. "Well, we could check if we keep the kitchen light on and open the back door a little," he offered. I thought for a second and agreed, but said we should stay right by the house. We slipped on our trainers and opened the back door. Stepping onto the patio, I felt the air was heavy and warm that night. Chris walked behind me. We stood very close to the door, peering at the back fence. "Should we—" I had just started to speak when he quickly stepped into the house again, still looking at the fence. "What?" I asked, following him in. I turned and realized that the figure was gone. It was obvious from the light coming from the back door that the fence and the rest of the garden was just as it always was. "Where is it?" Chris said. "If it was leaning against the fence, it probably fell over into a bush or something." I tried to convince us both. We stared out a few seconds later and decided we were too nervous to go and check. I don't usually give in to my night terrors, but now they were just beginning to click in my head. "Can you stay over for the night?" I asked Chris. Yeah, sure." It didn't sound like he really wanted to. He kept his eyes on the fence. We both went inside and locked the door before going up to my room. I got out a sleeping bag for Chris and drew the curtains without looking outside into the garden again. We talked about stupid stuff for a couple of hours to take our mind off the garden and fell asleep. In the morning, I found Chris's sleeping bag empty. I called out for Chris and he said he was downstairs, so I threw on a t-shirt and went down. "Sleep well?" I asked. "Yeah, pretty well. I kept thinking about the garden and stuff." "Hey, did you find that tent?" he returned. Yeah," I answered, remembering the shape that I wish I had forgotten about until now. "Well, I was thinking about the camping thing, and I thought maybe we could bring the tent into my house. It would just make a change, you know." I didn't have to ask him why. I wasn't keen on staying in my garden after last night either. Wait, last night? Come to think of it, the sun was up and I wanted to check the garden while it wasn't pitch black. I asked Chris and he hesitantly agreed. We put on our trainers and stepped into the back garden. I don't know what we were so worried about. It was bright and colorful. The plants and bushes around the edges of the garden smelled good, and there was a bird in one of the small trees singing out for its mate somewhere. We walked to the back fence to find nothing out of place, and looked over the bushes in front of the paneling to check if anything lay behind them. We found nothing. I walked around the edge of the whole garden once more, while Chris tried whistling to the bird. It cocked its head to side, trying to figure him out. It was a warm day, perfect for camping that evening, I decided. We talked as we filled a couple of rucksacks with sleeping bags and some food from the kitchen. We didn't want to set up a fire, so we packed some tinned hot dogs, bread, a packet of tomatoes, and chocolate, as well as some bottles of water. "There's a forest just next to my house, which is actually pretty good," Chris explained. "Our garden backs onto the edge of it. I stayed in a tent there once with my dad for my first little camping trip when I was like 7. I remember I was so excited at that time. I thought we were really roughing it, like some hardcore mountaineers." Chris laughed at himself. "If we get too cold or need more food, we can just go into my house. My parents are out, so we'll have free run of the place anyway." "Yours are away too?" I questioned. "It's their anniversary, so they're out for the night," he explained. "They're staying in a hotel at the next town over. They'll be back in the morning." Apparently leaving your kids behind was in fashion this summer. At about noon, we left my house with 2 rucksacks, a sleeping bag for each of us, and the tent, and made our way to Chris's house. It was fairly close by, and a part of the same pleasant neighborhood. We talked and joked a lot, walking side by side, nodding and greeting a couple of familiar neighbors as well. It was a crazy nice day. The sun was almost too much. It was hot on our necks, and the trees by the sidewalk seemed to glow green from underneath as sunlight passed through the leaves. A sprinkler offered us some water as we walked by one house, and it felt good on my hot arms. I was already sweating by the time we got to Chris's place. We hadn't been walking for more than 20 minutes. We didn't go inside his house immediately because it was so hot, so we went straight to the garden and dumped our bags in the shade. He wasn't joking. The gate of his garden backed straight into an impressive forest. Very tall, thin trees stood high above the house and continued as far as I could see. "Looks good, right?" he boasted. "It's awesome," I admitted, opening the gate and surveying the area. I walked out in between the trees and found a flat spot for the tent. I turned around to ask Chris's opinion and paused, a little disappointed. It didn't feel like real camping when his house was so obviously in our faces. "Let's go a little further in so it at least feels legit," I said, and walked to pick up my bags. We walked in a straight line from Chris's house and kept checking behind us until the house was just about obscured by trees in front of each other. We'd only gone a very short way in, but the forest was already thicker and greener. There was even a long rope swing hanging from one of the trees, but it looked too old to hold our weight, so we decided to keep our spines unbroken and give it a miss. I unpacked the tent and set it up with Chris's help, and we threw our sleeping bags inside. I laid down inside to check it out. It was so warm and humid I had to adjust my breathing. I stepped out again and asked Chris if he had a torch for the evening. "I can do better than that," was his response, and he took off towards the house. It was too hot to run after him, so I opened my rucksack and cracked open a bottle of water, downing half of it and putting the rest back in my pack. I laid down on a patch of grass and looked up at the canopy. The leaves were shifting gently, and the breeze I couldn't feel down here, and I lay there until I heard Chris return. "Did you get a torch?" I asked, closing my eyes. The sun shone through my eyelids and colored my vision red. I listened to the soft sound of his footsteps on the grass as he walked past me towards the rope swing. "That's not going to hold you," I warned, as I heard him tug the branch with a small creak. He tugged it, and it creaked in response. I listened. He tugged it once more, and again. There was a moment of silence as I guessed he was still weighing it up, then another tug. He continued to tug a few more times, and the creaking followed each one. I was sure it wouldn't hold his weight, and I smiled, predicting one big creak and a snap as the rope or the branch broke. I waited as some final tugs were made. "Yo!" I heard Chris's voice coming from his garden. I sat bolt upright, almost spraining my neck as I snapped my head sideways to face his house. He was jogging through the trees holding an electric lantern. I switched my gaze in the other direction towards the rope swing. It was hanging still, nothing nearby. I stood up and turned in a full circle, nothing in any direction. "What?" I mouthed to myself while walking towards the rope. I tugged it gently, but it didn't creak. I pulled it harder, and it didn't creak. My mouth went dry. I jumped up, grabbed hold, and yanked it down. The branch bent a little as my feet touched the floor, and it didn't make a sound. I kept hold of it as I stared up towards the branches, but eventually the rope gave way under my weight somewhere in the middle, and a soft thud fell on my ears as the thick rope fell in front of me. Chris was rattling the lantern as he came by. "I've never used this before. I got it for Christmas from my cousin. She buys some weird presents." I didn't respond. I continued looking up at the branch with half a rope swing tied to it. "Hey, are you good?" Chris followed my gaze. "I thought you'd already come back," I said immediately. I wasn't the type to let things slide with an, "Oh, it's nothing." "What?" he replied. "Someone walked by me and was messing around with the rope swing." "Who was it?" "I don't know." "Are they still around?" "I don't know. I had my eyes closed and I was just laying there." I pointed. "But then I heard you shout, so I looked around and there was nothing here. I heard them walk past my head." I felt a little bit sick. "Look, calm down a second," Chris began. "It's the middle of the day, we're 30 feet from my house, and even if it was a person, so what? It's just some public woods, anyone can come through here." That made some sense, and he was right about it being public. But then where were they? I glanced around one more time, however, the trees quickly layered up and I couldn't see far at all. I guessed it was possible for me to lose track of someone here in a short distance. "Okay," I said. "Man, I can stay alone in the house for weeks on end, but I can't handle a short walk through the woods on a summer's day." "That's why you brought some muscle," declared Chris, wielding the lantern above his head, and I laughed. We spent the day walking around the forest, and returned to the tent to get some water when we were too hot. We talked about school and what our plans were for the future. We talked about dreams we'd had, and ghosts and creatures that lurked in the dark. Neither of us were too scared of things like that, but they made for good camping stories. Chris told a particularly good one of a woman who lived in the woods. She had the head of a cat, and if you heard her raspy meow, that meant she was trying to find you. If she stopped meowing, it signified that you were found, and she was quickly making her way towards you. It made my skin crawl a little, and we stopped telling stories soon after that. The light of day eventually faded, and it was getting hard to see, so we headed back to the tent for the night. The impressive heat during the day had killed our appetites, so we left the food for now and decided we'd eat it in the night if we got hungry. Chris hung the electric lantern at the front of the tent, flicking it on as he did so. It was surprisingly bright and spilled a yellow light onto the ground and onto the trees that faced us. The warm glow looked dramatic, but whatever was beyond the light was hidden in blackness. Our immediate area was clear, but after a few paces the light seemed to stop dead. It looked weird. Chris ducked under the tent opening and I followed him. The sleeping bags looked inviting, and it was too cold for t-shirts and shorts. We got inside and took the lantern with us. "Can you hear meowing?" I said, my head tilted as I strained to hear. "Yeah, I hear some bullshit." Chris smiled and zipped up his sleeping bag. Damn, I thought I had him. Oh well. I zipped up my own bag and we laid there talking for a little while. Then the exhaustion of such a hot summer's day hit us and we fell asleep. I had a dream that we were walking to Chris's house again, but there were more trees than before, and it was getting dark very quickly. I blinked and suddenly it was night, and the forest was sprawling in every direction. The rope swing hung in front of me. I turned around and Chris was gone. I heard a creak behind me. A feeling came over me like I'd missed a step on the stairs. For some reason I couldn't turn around. I started walking straight ahead, and the rope swing soon came into view again. I was aware I was in a nightmare. The rope swing slowly lifted itself up into the trees, and I watched it disappear. I watched over and stood beneath where it had been, and there was a rustle above me. As I lifted my eyes to the canopy, a black figure with the head of a cat came hurtling downwards with its mouth open horrifically wide. One of its teeth touched my left eye, and I tore myself awake, gasping as I sat up in the tent. My back was damp with sweat, and Chris was asleep next to me. The lantern was still on, and I could see our backpacks at the end of the tent. I took a moment to breathe, and then let myself lay back down, my head thumping onto the floor a little too hard. I winced and reached out for the water bottle by my side, downing a few mouthfuls. I couldn't fall asleep with the glow of the lantern on my eyelids, so I sat up and searched the tent for it. I quickly realized the light was coming from outside. "Chris?" I said, still confused from sleep. He mumbled something in reply. "Chris, where's the lantern?" Somewhere," he said slowly and sleepily before turning over. Looking around again, the light was obviously coming from outside. I weighed up the options. Either some murderer had snuck into our tent and done nothing but take the lantern outside, or we didn't actually bring it into the tent and I'd remembered it wrong. That sounded more convincing. So I knelt by the tent door and unzipped it. From the opening I looked around. It wasn't immediately obvious where the glow was coming from. Why couldn't I see it? I looked up. The lantern was resting 20 feet in the air, hanging in the dark. Goosebumps swept across my skin and I zipped up the door before shaking Chris. "Chris, please wake up!" He heard the urgency in my voice and sat up. What? What's wrong?" Chris said, rubbing his eyes. "The lantern is hanging outside." "But I brought it in," he assured me. I felt sick as my reasoning broke. We both looked at the front of the tent. "We should go back to the house," I said, my resolve buckling. I was just a kid in the forest whose parents were away. "I'm not walking through the dark," he replied. Chris was now looking worried. "We've got a lantern," I stopped myself. I looked at the front of the tent again. We couldn't sit here forever. We were getting scared as we sat there doing nothing, so this was the plan. We weren't going back to sleep. We would get the lantern back somehow, leave everything here, and spend the night in Chris's house. Unzipping the fabric door, I looked around. Nothing. I peered over the tent behind us. Nothing in sight. Literally nothing. Everything was black outside the light. I took a step out and it was cold. Chris said the same as he stood by my side, looking over his shoulder. He turned back and saw the lantern in the air. Oh my God. We stood there looking at it for a few seconds. They seemed to crawl by. Eventually I worked out which tree it was hanging from. The broken rope swing at my feet confirmed it. Way up, out of reach, the lantern hung above our heads, tied to the other end of the rope that still dangled from the darkness. I couldn't work it out. It was too high up for even a ladder. The trees were thin and bare beside the leaves that made up the canopy. There was nowhere to climb. Picking up the length of rope that had snapped off earlier, I bundled it up and tied a knot and aimed it at the lantern. I took a step back and jumped, tossing it in the air. It caught the lantern on its side and sent it swinging. It threw shadows rocking around us. I suddenly wish I hadn't hit it. The light made the shadows lean from side to side with the lantern. The horrible, unnatural swaying made me panic and my eyes became wet as fear took a hold of me. I picked up the rope again and lobbed it desperately at the lantern. I missed and the bundle of rope sailed off into the darkness. Helplessly, I turned to Chris, who had already grabbed his backpack. He span around and threw it with a yelp, and it hit the lantern dead on. It fell and thudded to the floor with a crack, but the light was still on. I ran to pick it up. I turned to Chris and almost cried with relief. Go, 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 let's go, I urged, and he started jogging quickly towards the house as I followed. We half ran, half stumbled off into the dark, checking over our shoulders and working ourselves up as our thoughts were consumed by everything that may be waiting in the trees for us. I don't know how long we were moving, but it soon became apparent that Chris's house was not in this direction. For God's sake, where is it? Chris said, tension taking hold of his voice. We have to find the tent and try again. A couple of tears were forming in the corner of his eyes. They probably were on mine too, but my heart was thumping so hard I didn't even notice. Okay. I took a breath and we turned around, heading in a straight line directly behind us. What if we didn't find the tent? I couldn't stop thinking of that over and over as we retraced our steps. We walked for what seemed like twice as long before the light finally fell on the side of the tent. We ran up and stood close by its side, looking around and trying to figure out which direction we should go. The silence was like the buildup of a nightmare, right before some horrible thing lurches out at you, screaming. The comparison made me gag and I scrunched my eyes shut, the hair on my skin lifting. My temples were so hot it felt like my brain was thudding against the inside of my skull. I couldn't begin to guess where the house was. We could see about 10 feet from the lantern, and then pitch black. There were no clues. Every direction looked wrong. Chris took the lantern from me and walked in a small circle, straining his eyes to try to see. I stayed put. Chris, turn it off, I whispered to him hurriedly. What? He asked. I stepped quickly and quietly towards him, bringing my face to his. There's something in the tent. His gaze shifted past me towards the tent, and he stood there staring. We were standing on the left-hand side of the tent, and from this angle I could just about see the unzipped door hanging open. But I remembered leaving it that way, so that wasn't what was making me clench my teeth together. A few feet away, my rucksack sat outside on the dry earth, with the food I had packed, now neatly arranged, trailing from it. Our sleeping bags were also nicely laid out end to end, making a line of belongings that leads straight to the mouth of the tent. I took a careful step forward so the light could pass more easily through the fabric. It couldn't have been a trick of the light. Something big and dark was obviously crouched, with what I guessed was its front facing the open door. I hated myself for not seeing it sooner. It didn't move at all or even seem to breathe. It just sat, waiting for us to investigate the display it had made. Turn it off, I whispered again. Chris continued staring, deaf to me. Chris! I pleaded in a whisper. A voice from nearby joined in. Chris! It came from the tent. A slow, strained rasp of a voice that sounded like a parrot copying a new word. The sound clicked across my skin and crept into my ears. The light flicked off with a click that was too loud. Chris grabbed my shoulder and I clenched my fist closed painfully tight. We stood there in complete darkness. I didn't want to move, and I didn't want to stay. My brain fought for control as my legs waited for a decision rooted in place. Blackness pressing on our eyes like water. Sweat ran down my neck. I couldn't see the tent. Chris, turn it off. My stomach flipped inside out as the thing in the tent played with my words. I quickly grabbed Chris's hand, yanking him in the opposite direction. I ran like I never had before, Chris's legs thudding alternatively with mine. The sprint continued for about a minute. We'd lost ourselves as we ran through absolute darkness. I forgot where we were and I couldn't see what was in front of my face. I ran headfirst into a tree. My forehead struck its side with a sickening hollow knock. Sparks lit up inside my eyes as I choked back the pain. It hurt so much I couldn't breathe. Chris tried to pull me on, but I buckled to the floor on my knees and threw up. As I collapsed back onto my back, my head went numb. Chris lifted me up. Please don't stop. Please, please, please. He begged. I couldn't reply. Please keep going. I forced my legs to take my weight as I locked my knees upright, leaning on Chris. My body felt empty and a little blood rolled down my forehead and onto my brow. I wiped it away as I tried to grasp the situation again, but the pain was too much. Wait, I can't, I begged. Just wait. We stood together in the inky woods, but we could have been anywhere. I couldn't see Chris as he huddled next to me. It didn't feel like darkness. It felt like someone had wrapped my head in a blanket. Neither of us said a word as we waited, but our breathing was loud, and I wondered from what distance it could be heard. Reality began to return to me, and the pain was now just about bearable. I straightened up, grasping at what was happening. The pins of fear sank into me a second time, and I began counting in my head. 1 minute passed without any sound in the world. The wind was dead, and the birds might be too. Another minute went by. I continued counting. 3 minutes. We were still alone. Was it even looking for us? I reached for Chris's arm in the dark. He jumped when I touched it, but I steadied him with the other. He was still holding the lantern. Good. We had light on our side. Now if only we could use it. I went over the events hurriedly in my mind. The lantern was hanging from a tree. We got out of the tent. We couldn't find our way home. By the time we returned to the tent, something was in it. But then why did it take the lantern and do nothing while we slept? If it was sheer luck that we were alone when we were trying to get the lantern, I wondered just how small the possibility was of us getting a second chance. I stayed silent for a moment, and then whispered as best as I could, "Chris, we need to turn on the lantern. We need to get away from here. We can make a run for your house, but we need to see." "No, please, we have to stay here," Chris tried to whisper too. "We can wait till morning if we have to. You can't turn it on." I could hear in his voice that a sob was breaking through. "Just keep quiet. You have to, please." I parted my lips to try again, but as I did, I heard something. A very faint clicking sound from somewhere in the dark. It was almost inaudible, but it was there. An irregular, stuttering, clicking sound. It sounded like fingernails on a wooden table. And it was moving. It came from in front of us, I was sure of it. A steady click, click, click filled my ears as we tried to gauge the distance. It was drawing closer. It stopped. I was glad for the first time in my life that I couldn't see what was waiting in the dark. Perhaps that meant we were also hidden. As my thoughts fired off in every direction, I gave the thing in the darkness the image of the cat-headed woman, and it terrified me. I was just waiting to hear that meow. But my ears were met with something else. "Chris?" I tensed my throat and tried not to cry. "Chris?" It said his name twice, and I cupped my hand over my mouth. The horrible, scraping dialogue sounded a few steps away. The words were said oddly, with no meaning behind them. They were just sounds that this thing had picked up, and was now using them to catch us out in the dark. Chris let go of my hand, and I heard his foot plant softly in the grass behind him as he prepared to run. "Don't you dare." I tried to project into his mind. "Don't you make a sound." "Chris, please." Upon hearing his name again, Chris instinctively, and without thought, began to run. It's probably the only reason that I made it back. And that's the end of Turn It Off. This is a story by Daniel Dubois. I found on the Creepypasta wiki. I made some changes, mostly to the end, just so that it would fit within the video a little better. But if you want to check out the original, please do so by clicking the link in the description. And I hope you enjoyed this scary story. All the music was done by Myuuji on YouTube. He does wonderful royalty-free horror music, and I really recommend him if you need anything of this nature. And I hope you all have a happy Halloween. Oh, and one last thing. I now have a Patreon, so if you want some behind-the-scenes stuff and hopefully soon some bonus videos that won't be going up on YouTube, please check the link below and become a patron, and you can get access to all kinds of good stuff. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good night.